Investor Ivan is like Portfolio Paul's bigger cousin. And if you haven't seen that video, make sure you check out our playlist on it. But Investor Ivan is someone who's building a portfolio of businesses. But unlike Portfolio Paul, they have raised sometimes in the scope of millions of dollars from outside financing sources such as angel investors, private equity, family offices, and more. Investor Ivan is a big deal. They are the most well-funded buyer persona there is, and they have a lot of interesting things going on for them. But unlike Portfolio Paul, they're not looking just to build a stream of diversified income. They're looking to build a full-on, full-scale enterprise. Let's go ahead and talk about Investor Ivan. Hey everyone, my name is Gregory Elfrink. I am the Director of Marketing over at Empire Flippers, where we help people just like you every single day of the week buy and sell online businesses. So today in our Buyer Persona series, we are talking about Investor Ivan. Investor Ivan is probably one of the most interesting buyer personas out there, and probably a lot of people want to become Investor Ivan, but it can be difficult to be this persona because you need to have a bit of a background in things, in business in general. So usually Investor Ivan is going to have a pretty good business acumen. In fact, they probably have some of the most extensive business experience of any of our buyer personas. Think about people who've gone and got their MBA in financing at the Wharton Business School or some other Ivy League kind of campus. Often this is where Investor Ivans come from. They've often worked in private equity, or they have already built pretty large businesses where they are already talking on a private equity kind of level. And they're very similar to Portfolio Paul, as I mentioned in the hook of this video, because like Portfolio Paul, they're building out a huge portfolio of businesses. They're buying several different brands. They're often buying 1 to 4 businesses a month, so they are very aggressive. But unlike Portfolio Paul, they're not looking to just build a diversified stream of income. They are looking to proactively scale all their acquisitions into something much, much bigger. They are often looking to roll up all of their acquisitions into one company. They're looking to build teams like management, thought leaders, and there are multiple different levels, all the way from someone operating on the front line of the business to the actual managers overseeing those people. And then there might even be a brand manager in control of each of the different brands that they acquire. It really depends on how they're doing it, but their end goal is not to build a portfolio of diversified income. Their end goal is to be able to roll up all of these companies into one giant company that they can then sell off for a much, much higher multiple to people like private equity. If you're not familiar with how private equity or family offices actually buy businesses, basically what they're looking for is a business that is, one, usually over $10 million, because anything less than $10 million is usually not going to be worth their time, but they're also looking for management that is good and stable with good processes that allows them to take over that company, because private equity doesn't really operate companies usually. They usually have people in place that are operating the business. So Investor Ivan, they might have raised money from private equity or family offices or maybe from somewhere else, but their end goal is to take what they've built and sell it back to private equity. Now, not all the time. Sometimes Investor Ivan does have different goals, but this is often the goal. They want to do an IPO or they want to sell to private equity. They have some big lucrative exit in mind. Okay, so now you know who Investor Ivan is. What kind of businesses do they look at buying? Like if you want to become an Investor Ivan, what would be your buying criteria when it comes to buying an online business? Well, it's actually pretty simple. If you've been following this buyer persona series, and if you haven't, make sure you subscribe to the bell. You'll get notified every time a new video comes up. There's also a playlist on here. You can go watch the other videos. But Investor Ivan has a very similar criteria in a sense to someone like a newbie norm, where they aren't always looking for a distressed asset. Like that's not a thing that they are particularly keen on buying. Sometimes it is, but it's more likely that they're looking at buying just a business that's already high quality. They don't want to go in and fix a bunch of problems. They want to go in and scale that business dramatically. That's the thing that they're operating under. And they can do that because they have deep capital. So they can go and hire the teams they need, the systems they need, all that kind of stuff. And if the business is already a high quality business, that just makes it that much easier for them to scale typically. Because a lot of these businesses, the reason why the seller can't scale is because they just don't have the capital. They have to bootstrap their way to each new level of income, versus Investor Ivan doesn't have to play that way. He can go and scale aggressively almost out of the gate. So that is one of the big reasons why Investor Ivans are often looking at e-commerce businesses in particular. Amazon FBA is a great example of this, because in order for you to grow an Amazon FBA business, you're constantly reinvesting your profits to get to that next level as you're ordering more and more inventory to meet the ever-growing demand you are creating. But with Investor Ivan, they can just automatically scale up. They don't have to reinvest all their profits slowly to get to the next level. They already have enough capital to scale right away. So that's a big reason why they look at Amazon FBA and e-commerce stores in particular. Now, they do look at other ones. Obviously, there are Investor Ivans in the content space and SaaS space as well, but the most common monetization we have seen is for sure in the e-commerce space. Now, another thing about Investor Ivan's buying criteria is they often will have the strictest criteria. So if you want to be an Investor Ivan, what you need to do is come up with a very, very strict criteria of what you're looking for. This is often called an investment thesis. So you might look for Amazon FBA businesses at least 2 years old with this amount of reviews, this amount of profit, this amount of products, and all that kind of stuff. And it is very unlikely you will ever move away from this thesis, especially since you most likely raised money from outside sources and you use this investment thesis to convince them to give you money in the first place. They will want to make sure you are sticking to the plan you outlined to them when they handed you the money, right? So that is Investor Ivan. They have very strict buying criteria. But while they might have a strict buying criteria, they are often the most reasonable when it comes to paying a seller, in the sense that they are willing to pay that seller. So if you're Investor Ivan, you should be willing to pay that seller a reasonable amount of money. Again, because you have so much capital you've raised, this is kind of like your blunt tool advantage, right? Another buyer like a Flipper Fred going up against an Investor Ivan to buy the same business, Flipper Fred is almost always going to lose, because Flipper Fred really makes their money on the buy, versus Investor Ivan, they're going to make their money on the scaling of the business, because they're not looking to just do a fast flip. They're looking to do a much, much bigger thing than what Flipper Fred is usually doing. So because of that, they can often offer that seller a lot more money. And between the two offers, if a seller is going to go with a Flipper Fred that is trying to get a discount versus Investor Ivan's offering a good premium price, it's pretty obvious the seller will usually choose Investor Ivan, right? And by the way, if you're a seller and you want to find these Investor Ivans to buy your business, my number one advice is to use a broker. Now that sounds super self-serving considering what we do, but trust me, it is the right move. And the reason why I say that is because even though Investor Ivans, they will invest heavily in building their own private deal flow, they all shop at brokers. So every single Investor Ivan, for the most part, that is looking to buy and acquire online businesses, yes, they might have good deal flow. It might even be the primary way they acquire a business. They are still going to be acquiring businesses from basically all the brokers in the industry. So by you using a broker, you force all the Investor Ivans to compete for you. And while Investor Ivans will not usually discount you, even in a private deal, they'll often give you a pretty reasonable rate. It's always better to have more Investor Ivans competing against each other for your acquisition. So that just makes sense to me. Now, if you're Investor Ivan, if you want to become Investor Ivan, do the exact opposite of what I just said. You want to have this private deal flow, and often you'll be able to convince a seller that, hey, you don't need to go private because or you don't need to go with a broker and pay that commission. I'm going to give you the same amount that the broker is going to give you anyways. And unlike most private deals, usually that is correct. Usually a Investor Ivan will pay you reasonably close to what a broker was going to get you anyways. The major difference for a seller, the advantage for a seller to use a broker is, again, to make those investors to compete and thus drive the price up for you. If you want a fast sell and you go with a private Investor Ivan, that can work out wonderfully as well. But as an Investor Ivan yourself, if you want to become an Investor Ivan, you want to make sure you are building your own private deal flow as well as leveraging the brokers that are out there, and make sure you maintain good relationships with them all, because you're going to be a customer of brokers quite a lot. Like, especially in the beginning when you first raise that money and you probably don't have much private deal flow at all. Brokers are probably going to be your primary acquisition strategy for the first year to maybe even 2 years as an Investor Ivan shop. So keep all that stuff in mind. Another thing about the buying criteria on Investor Ivan, I mentioned this, I believe it was with Portfolio Paul, but it might have been on another buyer persona, is at least in e-commerce businesses, a lot of times other buyer personas want more than one product. They want more than one SKU holding up the whole business, because if that one SKU goes away, the whole business dies, right? Investor Ivans, while they do have stricter criteria, it usually isn't a big deal to them if you only have one product, because it's all a numbers game, right? If I'm a newbie norm and I'm looking at buying a $200,000 business that has one product, that can seem very risky to me. But if I'm an Investor Ivan and I'm looking at $1 million Amazon FBA business that only has one product, but I have also raised $50 million to go out specifically to acquire businesses, that isn't as risky to me because I have $49 million more to make a home run. And this $1 million business will probably be a home run for me too if I did my due diligence and all that good stuff, right? So it's just less risky for an Investor Ivan to buy a one product business because again, they have the advantage of capital. So Investor Ivans are really acquisition machines. If you want to become an Investor Ivan, outside of just raising money, you should be proactively building a plan of at least acquiring 1 to 2 businesses a month, probably more, especially if you're just starting out. And you need to have good systems in place, which I'll get to in a second, on what to do once you acquire those businesses. The usual price ranges for an Investor Ivan on where they're looking at buying is usually between like the $600,000 level on the low end, all the way up to $15 to $20 million on the higher end for most of these digital assets. Of course, there's caveats to everything, but typically that's where we see the range. Most of them are buying between $1 and $2 million assets as they start getting going. And as they get going and prove their thesis to be correct, they will often start buying bigger businesses and edge themselves up that way. So how do you become this Investor Ivan and raise all this money and all that kind of stuff? Well, we're probably not going to like this answer, but the number one way for you to become an Investor Ivan is simply making good connections. So you need to go out and around and talk to these private equity firms, these family office firms, or angel investors, etc., and make real connections. And again, you need to have a good thesis, a good investment thesis of what you're going to do. But you also need to make these investors, these people giving you the money, believe in your criteria, believe in your investment thesis. And one of the easiest ways you can do it, well, I don't know how easy it is necessarily, it will take you some work for sure if you're brand new, but one way you can prove to them of your investment thesis without them ever giving you any money is simply by building one of these businesses yourself or buying a smaller one that meets that criteria that you've created, except for it's just a smaller priced business, and building it up. Because if you built an Amazon FBA business or even bought one, say you bought an Amazon FBA business for $100,000 and you built that business up over a year to $500,000 in terms of its valuation, then that's awesome, because a person who can run a $500,000 Amazon FBA business can probably pretty decently run a $1 to $3 million Amazon FBA business. Because while it is bigger, often the problems are the same, they're just scaled up a little bit, and often the solutions to the scaled up problems are similar to what you're already dealing with. So if you can prove you have a track record, that is super helpful for you to raise this money. Also, that brings me to the next point. If you want to be an Investor Ivan, this is a common theme throughout all of these buyer personas, you probably noticed, but you want to really focus on one chosen business model. You want to become the expert, the ninja, the guru of this space, right? You want to know everything about it like the back of your hand. That is how you become a domain expert, and that's how you can, again, make these investors have confidence in what you're doing and how you're doing it. So as an Investor Ivan, your biggest advantage as a buyer persona versus the other buyer personas is your deep well of capital. And this works for you on several different levels. I already mentioned the first level where you can basically use your capital to beat out the other buyers. So again, if you're going up against a Flipper Fred on an acquisition, you can just outpay Flipper Fred and the seller will most likely accept you, and the Flipper Fred won't be able to compete because you're eating too much into their flipping margins to make it worth their while now, right? So you can often use your capital as this blunt instrument to get the acquisition, but there's another way your capital gives you a huge advantage. And this is actually going to help you long-term in this business model, in this buyer persona, because if you really want to sell a full-on enterprise that you have built, you're going to have to do this anyways. And that is using your capital to build a a world-class team. You want to acquire talent just as much as you want to acquire businesses. So while yes, you should be looking at a $1-2 million Amazon FBA business to buy, you should also be looking to spend $70,000 to maybe even $150,000 on an employee that is just a rock star with Amazon display ads or some other form of marketing or some other form of business operations, and really build this world-class team. Use your capital to not just build these frontline soldiers going out there and making your businesses bigger, but also to groom or nurture or also acquire talent that can manage these people on the front line for you. So you really want to build layers within your organization. You should only be really focused on talking to your general managers who are running the whole machine and going out and acquiring more businesses. That's really the way you need to be set up. In fact, the way I have seen it is there's often brand managers. You might have 1 or 3 brands. They have a little team underneath them, and you might even have someone whose whole thing is being a head of acquisitions for you. So now you're meeting with maybe the overseer, the general manager of all the different brand managers, and the head of acquisitions, and maybe the head of acquisitions has a little team as well going about building their business, building your Investor Ivan business. You know, the head of acquisitions might also have a marketing team that is all focused on private deal flow and all that kind of stuff, right? So really think big. Think about how your organized structure is going to work, because you have the advantage to actually go out and build one of these relatively quickly. Like, you can go out and build this organization within about a year. Now, you might not have like the best systems and all that kind of stuff. That's a tweaking thing that happens over time, but you have the capital to go out and do that. And again, this gives you a huge advantage because you can move fast both on the acquisition, but also on scaling. And you don't have to do everything yourself. If you try to do everything yourself as an Investor Ivan, it's just not going to work, because your end strategy is not going to work. Because if your end strategy is to sell to private equity and you're doing everything, they're not going to want to buy you at all, right? Because there's no one to operate the business. So you need to nurture talent. That is one of the big things. You need to become a leader. You need to have good management skills, good business acumen, and having a financial background in particular, a financial education background, is super important when you're looking at numbers and doing financial modeling and all that super fun stuff. Now, in terms of mindset, an Investor Ivan is pretty different from some of these other buyer personas we talked about. So for example, Lifestyle Larry, they're all about the beach, living on the beach, working that 4-hour-a-week lifestyle, right? Investor Ivan is not at all about that. Like, they might like beaches, they might like coconuts, they might even like 4 hours, but they are often working much more than that. They are usually working at least 40-50 hours a week. You know, think in a typical investment banker lifestyle, right? Like, those people are working very long hours, and that's okay if that's what you want to do. Just realize it is going to be long hours, it's going to be intense, but it can also be extremely meaningful. And unlike Lifestyle Larry, well, there's some caveats with Lifestyle Larry, but unlike them, you most likely will be able to build something extremely worthwhile in just a span of a few short years. Like there's a client of ours that has raised literally hundreds of millions of dollars. They bought businesses from us. One in particular, they bought, I think it was 2 years ago, is $1.8 million, somewhere around there. And now it's worth like $5 million over 2 years. That is a huge ROI, right? And that is just one of many different companies that they have bought over the last 2 or 3 years. So you can do some really big things if you are committed to being an Investor Ivan. Just realize that if your goal is to be more of a Lifestyle Larry, and you might like the Investor Ivan persona, you might like the idea of it, but you might not like it in practice. So always keep that in mind. Or it might be vice versa, right? You might think like, I think I really like the beach stuff. You get out to the beach like, wait, no, I want to build this crazy empire. The beach is not right for me, right? So it really is up to you and your own personal style. So that is Investor Ivan in a nutshell. If you want to find out what kind of buyer persona you are, you can check out our buyer persona quiz down below. It's a free, fun little quiz, and it'll tell you who you are. And if you don't like who you are based off that quiz, that is 100% okay. Because if you've been following the buyer persona series, you already know this, but all of this is transmutable. You can evolve from one persona to the next as you level up in your investing career. So it's no big deal if you start off as a newbie norm, and there's nothing stopping you from ending up as an Investor Ivan. So in the next video, we're going to be covering Strategic Sally, who is also one of the only buyer personas that can usually beat Investor Ivan when it comes to buying a business. And I will tell you why they can beat Investor Ivan in the next video. But if you enjoyed this video, if you're enjoying this series in general and our YouTube content, it would mean a lot to me if you go ahead and hit the subscribe bell. And when you do hit that, you'll be notified every time we do a new video. We do videos all the time on buying and selling online businesses, but also just in general, business advice, marketing advice, and all that kind of stuff. So if you like this video, leave a comment and subscribe. It'll help my ego, and I will talk to you soon. Bye.